We're into the home stretch. All right, our final keynote panelist for the day is Jeffrey Schnapp. He is the faculty director of MetaLab at Harvard. And I'm so sorry, I was about to go MetalAb. It's MetaLab, not MetalAb. I know, when you actually have the lowercase and the uppercase to prevent that from happening. But lowercase is no match for me. It is a research and teaching collaborative dedicated to exploring network culture in the arts and humanities. He is also faculty co-director of the Berkman Center for Internet and Society, professor of Romance Languages and Literature, and on the teaching faculty in the Department of Architecture at Harvard's GSD. And his most recent books are Speed Limits and the Electric Information Age book. Welcome, Jeffrey Schnapp. He's talking about man-machine morality.
Okay. Actually, the notion that MetaLab might actually be like some kind of like death metal, sort of club or something. MetalAb is one that has accompanied the life of MetaLab. So I'm going to be providing an introduction to the theme of man, machine, and morality, and I want to start out. And this is the risk that you run by inviting a cultural historian to speak to you at a design conference with that middle word, machine, and to really pose the question of what we understand by the word machine. I mean, the word machine has a rather rich history that I think suggests many of the kinds of tensions that are going to be featured in the projects that will be under discussion in this last panel. And these are also features that I think have already arisen in some of the prior panels. I mean, the word machine comes from the Greek mechane, which quite literally means a device, an instrument, something that enables. The notion that that process of enabling may include moving parts is a very late addition to the concept of machine. The core normative concepts of machine in the ancient world are the notion of the cosmos as the sort of defining machine, and the microcosmos that is humanity, imagined as in some kind of specular relationship to the wheels that drive the cosmic structures. Those are certainly founding kind of normative concepts of the machine that I think begin to suggest why in this triad the word machine serves as a kind of glue here, a kind of glue that raises questions of enablement, questions of agency, of making, certainly questions of power, the ability to perform certain kinds of actions, the ability to extend the capabilities either of human cognition or of human physical powers. And within this larger kind of arc of history, the issue that I'm interested in talking about, above all, it really is a kind of a passage that is, I guess, could fall broadly under the rubric of Back to the Future, the sense that for us, the normative concept of the machine is, of course, a concept that's very closely tied to the idea of the mechanical as being made up of these contrivances, these artificial constructions that have moving parts and therefore perform certain actions that are in relation to human actors. And the passage from that kind of concept of the machine to maybe a fourth M that could be added to this list, but is in a sense the kind of normative instantiation of the mechanical in our contemporary culture, which is, of course, media, the way in which certain forms of solid state and post-solid state electronics perform extensions of the human and raise the sorts of societal questions that are very much on the table today. Now, I want to start here with a very powerful machine that's familiar to all of you, which is a hammer. And what anthropologists tell us about the hammer is that a hammer is not just an object that, of course, has a function in any simple sense. It also scripts a whole extension and rethinking of what a human being is. Hammering is a specialized activity. It focuses the abilities of the human body on a certain set of tasks, and it implies a kind of sensorial focus, a kind of narrowing, a specialization. That is to say, the loss of certain capabilities that in a pre-hammering era humans might have been endowed with, and to become hammerers, to be the adequate manipulators of this powerful instrument. The human body, certain mental capacities, even a whole sort of social choreography are presupposed that reshape the very concept of what it is to be a human. So tools, machines of different kinds, whether they're machines that have moving parts or they're machines that are like the hammer, a kind of elementary extension of human capabilities, they always involve some kind of script involving either physical or cognitive specialization, a gain and a loss at the same time. Secondly, they involve certainly notions of discipline, whether that's a social discipline or it's a series of forms of discipline that are mental or physical on the part of the operator, the actor. They create forms of social distinction. I know how to use a hammer, you do not. In primitive societies, that might have been a significant distinction. They expand agency, the power of the actor who manipulates the object. But of course, they also create a reversible sense of agency. When you have a hammer in your hand, of course, that very hammer becomes an instrument that can be used against you, that can inflict violence upon you, that can reduce the powers of the self, even as it extends the powers of a particular self. And within that larger sort of performance script, of course, we enter a world of stories, of narratives, of metaphors, of symbolic meanings, where the hammer becomes more than an object. It becomes an object of reference with relation to ideas about power, of identity, force, strength, and so forth. Now, I'm not going to dwell on this topic at great length, but one of the most powerful shaping tools, one of the most powerful machines that shaped the world of communications, which is the one I'm going to close with, is, of course, printing as a technology. And this printed page, which is a completely I could have chosen almost any industrial era book as an example, is itself an incredibly powerful cognitive machine, and we tend to forget about just all of the work that it does to limit the act of reading to a very, very concrete physical set of procedures that have mental and cognitive counterparts. And the reason I mention this is I'm by training a medievalist, actually, even though I mostly work as a 20th century cultural historian. And for me, this is not the normal condition of knowledge. In ancient texts, for instance, word separation did not exist. You could not read a text unless you performed the text, because the very units of meaning, the notion of the word as a fundamental unit of meaning, was simply not part of the set of assumptions about what writing as a technology or technique implied. So, but it's not just word separation, it's a whole series of spatial decisions about what a page is. The use of an indexing system with page numbers, the page as a unit, as a compositional unit, the subordination of all secondary forms of textuality to a primary text. This is a text that stages primacy, the very notion of the primary text, by surrounding, I couldn't have anticipated that Michael, in his prior presentation, mentioned medieval manuscript culture as an example, but when we move from, for instance, a concept of a textual machine like a late medieval illuminated codex to an industrially printed page, I think you can see why people in the late Middle Ages thought that printing was a technology about loss of several crucial, what were thought to be fundamental aspects of human culture and communication. One of those losses was color. The loss, manuscript culture was polychromatic. And indeed, the margin was not a space that was there to frame, to let a primary text shine forth in its almost neutral, perfectly standardized, spaced out, ordered perfection. But on the contrary, it was a space of intervention where the very act of reading involved writing. There was no separation between reading and writing. To perform an act of reading was to rewrite a text, to transcribe a text, to write between the lines of a text, to annotate it, to illuminate it. And the very notion of authorship bled into this very extended kind of fluid, porous concept of what a text was. And as you can imagine, the cultural models that correspond to a concept of a text as a kind of machine for producing certain forms of communication are fundamentally different, and they imply fundamentally different ideas about the nature of human culture, society, and authorship, individuality, the signature, what it means to engage in forms of communication. Now, in the industrial era, when we move into an era where the concept of machine has shifted from this kind of universal concept of the machina, the device that enables, that makes possible, that expresses power, to the concept of industry, of industrial machinery. I'm going to talk just briefly about two scenarios, two scripts that tend to dominate accounts, narratives that are constructed culturally around the relationship between the human and the mechanical. One of them, which is illustrated in very different moments, different ways, and with different political ideologies. In this slide, we have on your left Fernand Léger's 1914 Man with a Pipe, and on your right, Renato Bertelli's simultaneous portrait of Mussolini from 1934. One of these models is a model that imagines a kind of ideal convergence between the human and the mechanical, where the boundary line is lost between the world of these artificial devices with moving parts and the world of the human body as itself an environment made up of different functions, moving parts, capabilities, and so forth. In the case of Léger, the entire space in which, the domestic spaces in which humanity lives, become a machine for living in the good kind of Corbusier sense, where even the pet dog is become a kind of mechanical creature whose body language, whose body forms are in perfect conformity with the furnishings, all of the affordances of the domestic environment of this new industrial world. And the man with a pipe, the very act of smoking is here, I think, very explicitly associated with the idea of smokestacks, of productivity, of a kind of happy convergence between the human and the mechanical that frees us from the burdens of effort, the fatigue of physical labor, that opens up all kinds of emancipatory possibilities. Now, in a very different context, with very different sorts of social fantasies at stake, Bertelli, when he was trying to imagine an image of a modern political leader who barely sleeps because he reads 50, 60 newspapers a day, who's constantly vigilant, who can see all around him, he imagines in this sort of futurist fantasy of the leader of the future, Mussolini, as a sort of profile, who without losing his singularity, without giving up his identity and becoming reduced to mechanical parts, retains his singular identity, and yet he is constantly in motion to the point of becoming almost like a kind of surveillance, a cross between a surveillance device, a kind of media device, a camera, and a kind of electrical insulator. I mean, some kind of peculiar hybrid. And these sorts of fantasies are widespread. I mean, this is from just an illustrated futuristic book, The World of 2013. And we see these sorts of fantasies that prevail within Taylorist iterations of industrial culture, and that imagine the human body constantly as engaged in this sort of process of convergence with the mechanical. Now, there's another narrative, which is a narrative that takes us back to the same period, that I'm going to illustrate here just briefly with Filippo Tommaso Marinetti and the founding of Futurism, which is a slightly different fantasy, a social fantasy. And it's a social fantasy that imagines a convergence between the human and mechanical that's built around a divergence rather than a convergence, where the mechanical is imagined as a kind of enemy world, as a world made up of powerful objects that are in a rivalrous competitive relationship to the human. And therefore, a battle ensues. The history of industrial civilization is about this conflict, which, as it's imagined by several early avant-gardes, Futurism in particular, is a conflict that extends the human even as it places it in constant peril. And in fact, the real role of the automobile as this sort of fulfillment of the human capability of going beyond mere natural forms of locomotion is the accident. The accident is, in a sense, the proof that this bond between the human and the mechanical is an interesting bond because it is built on friction, on tension, on the struggle to survive between the human and the mechanical. And I mention these because I think in the projects that we're going to be discussing in the course of our closing panel, this question about reversible agency, about questions about social distinction, questions about the extension of the power of human actors, questions about the boundary line between play and training, if you like, questions regarding the specialization of the sensorium that's involved in forms of education. Is the hammer that's used to train children to engage in this kind of play behavior a kind of skilling that is superior, for instance, to the kinds of skills associated with experiencing the world, experiencing interaction, through a screen-based device? These are the kinds of social questions that I think underlie many of the key issues in our own era. And certainly the question of whether educational practices should address the entire sensorium of human experience, or rather be concentrated, as is the case with screen-based models of interactive toys, for instance. This is going to be the theme of one of the three presentations, is a theme that's been an ongoing debate within educational theory in the modern era, going way, really back to the beginning of the 20th century. And in futurist practice, we see these examples of tactile tables as an attempt to reintroduce into a culture that's moving towards visuality as the normative context of cultural communication, to reintroduce the sense of touch as a kind of foundational sense. So we have Bruno Munari's tactile table on the bottom and Marinetti's Paris, Soudan on the top. Now, this same question will apply to the project on health spas and health clubs that we're going to be talking about as well, where we see this notion of the hammer as a kind of founding instrument of expanded agency, circulating as both a figurative and a literal shaping element within the larger emergence of a bodybuilding culture as an extension of the culture of self. And of course, this has a deep history that goes back to the late 19th century. There are two dominant iterations of health culture, of physical culture, that start in the middle of the 19th century and triumph at the beginning of the 20th century. This, for those of you who are not historians of physical culture, is the great Eugene Sandow, who was the founding father of modern bodybuilding. He used to perform these kinds of spectacular tasks of lifting. But he's also the father of the bungee cord, not surprisingly, because the bungee cord was itself created as a result of, by the way, English colonialism that created the possibilities for importing the kind of rubber that was required to create these strength creation devices. So we have a kind of machine technology, sort of avant la lettre, before the era of contemporary health clubs, that, of course, had a kind of uncanny productivity, which we find in our own daily life environment. And then finally, the third project we'll be talking about focus precisely on firearms and their relationship to the larger history of design, with the hammer structure that's fundamental to the history of modern carbines, and which of course raises this broader question about ideas about expanded strength, selfhood in relation to society. And the very instruments, these instruments that expand agency, of course, can be instruments that are manipulated by the state, that extend an individuality of a dictator. They can also be anti-state elements. They can be affirmations, as we see in American sort of popular culture and mythology, of an individuality, concepts that are rooted in a whole series of social myths. And this will be on the table for our roundtable discussion. Now, in my own work, most recent work, I've become particularly interested in a different kind of machine, which is, in a sense, learning spaces, the future of learning spaces, particularly libraries. So what happens to an institution that's as venerable, that has such a deep history, architecturally as well as socioculturally, as the library, as we face the series of challenges that the digital revolution has brought about? And particularly as forms of redundancy in information become such a dominating feature of forms of cultural communication and scientific communication. And I've been involved in two sides of this. One is designing the digital library of the future, and the other is designing the physical library that would intersect with that digital library, because I continue to think that the physicality of the library will be a defining feature of its role, because those roles that libraries have played are not limited to the storage and retrieval of documents. They're profoundly social, profoundly civic, profoundly political, profoundly engaged in forms of knowledge production and reproduction. So I'm just going to, in closing here, just talk about some of the design process that we're involved in around this whole question of how do you create an environment that somehow meshes a world of documents that's migrating towards digital forms, where physical documents are so prolific, so abundant, they continue to abound, that they cannot be stored on site, that they are moving off site, and yet preserve those social functions, those fundamental functions that libraries have played over the course of history. What you're looking at are this is the true Harvard Library. It's the deep storage structure. It holds 7 million volumes. It's much bigger than any of the physical libraries that you can visit. So it's a kind of allegory for this problem of the future of the library that we're facing. The challenge really is thinking of a world where storage and retrieval is no longer a sufficient answer to what a library is. So what kind of effects should this environment that is meant to extend our ability to know, to exchange knowledge, to create knowledge, what kind of environment should that be? How should we imagine it? How do we design right for that seam between the digital and traditional physical sorts of environments? And what I'm going to show you just in closing here are just a couple of student projects that were our pieces. We don't need the sound here. They're student projects that are attempting to imagine worlds where the boundary line between digital media and physical environments is crossed, and to imagine a world, for instance, where circulating books talk back to users, where the social dimensions of the library as an institution are visible to everybody, not just to those who are operating inside those institutions. So this is a device for allowing books to tell you, once you've searched for a book, to actually find you. Or a device, for instance, that allows you to place a book on a surface and to learn its biography. In other words, the life of a book. Who's had it? What kind of categories of readers have used it? How long did they use it for? What other books are related to it, are part of a family? Or devices for navigational paths within libraries that allow you to share such paths. Or imagining carols as spaces of exhibition as well as spaces of silent contemplation and study. Or a reference desk that now finds you. Or a library that exists at every bus stop where the act of reading is brought out into public spaces. Or a device that is your little reading buddy who keeps track of what you do, reminds you, gets irritated when attention is not paid to your friend Biblio. Or napping carols that would allow you to actually carry on other kinds of activities in public spaces like libraries. And last but not least, to try to imagine, I'm going to just move forward here because I know we're short on time. I'm going to close here with one of the key design questions that I'm interested in, which is how do we design silence, contemplation, offline spaces in a world where the norm has now become interconnectivity? What does it mean to think about disconnecting? Like, what are the social dimensions of disconnection in a world where connection is now the norm? Thank you.